then returned to run the farm. The Hendricksons raised milk cows, calves, and chickens, but specialized in poultry breeding. Around 1930, Mr. Hendrickson began to collect weather data, and he's been the East End's resident weather expert ever since. For most of these years, he has carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket where he made notes of interesting facts about the weather. And last year, his observations about the weather were made into a wonderful book titled Winds of the Fish's Tail. I believe we have a copy of it here for you to look at later on. Mr. Hendrickson has long been interested in the history of firearms and in Indian artifacts as well, and has given generously of his time and expertise in all of these areas to countless groups of all ages. We are very grateful to him for being here tonight to help remember the hurricane of 1938. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hendrickson. Our next guest is Mr. Harry Williams, a lifelong resident of the Shinnecock Indian Reservation. Mr. Williams was born one of 6 siblings, I believe all of whom still live on the reservation, attended Southampton schools, then enrolled in the Army during World War II, where he spent time in Europe working as an engineer. After the war, he returned to Southampton and spent the next 35 years working at night as a night clerk at Bayberry Land in Southampton, and spent his days working for BR Moving Company during these same years. Over the years, Mr. Williams was active as an elder for the Presbyterian Church on the reservation and served as chairman of the trustee board of the Shinnecock Reservation for 32 years. Since the death of Henry Best, known as Chief Thunderbird, Harry Williams has been recognized as ceremonial chief of the Shinnecock Powwow. He's a member of the Golfers Association on the reservation, and since the death of his wife, Rebecca, enjoys spending time with his 3 grown-up stepchildren and their children, some of whom are with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. Next to Mr. Williams is another local resident who has kindly consented to be here to tell us about her experiences as a teenager during the hurricane of 1938. Her name is Barbara Lord. Mrs. Lord was born in New York City and attended school as a child at a country day school on First Neck Lane, then later attended schools in Manhattan and in Virginia. In 1948, she married J. Cooper Lord, whose family also had a home in Southampton, and they moved to Buffalo, where Mr. Lord practiced law, and together they raised 4 children. During their years in Buffalo, they summered in Southampton, and in 1980, they moved here permanently. Over the years, Barbara Lord has given generously of her time and talents to this community. She serves as treasurer and has served in the past as president of the Village Improvement Association of Southampton. She is the current president of the board of the Southampton Nursing Home and is a member of the Southampton Garden Club. Mrs. Lord is the mother of 3 grown children, one of whom we are happy to have in our audience tonight. Please welcome Barbara Lord. Our last guest is a familiar face to many of us in Southampton, and his name is Harry Martin. Harry Martin can trace his roots in Southampton back more than a century and has spent his entire life here except for time serving in the Army during World War II. Mr. Martin graduated from Southampton High School in 1935 and started working full-time for Bellows Nursery in Southampton. He entered the Army in 1942 and returned to town in 1946 after the war. Although a national member of the VFW since 1945, Mr. Martin is credited with having integrated the Southampton VFW with his membership in 1954. During the years since then, he has been commander of the VFW for 4 terms and has served as quartermaster for the past 10 years. And many of you, no doubt, have seen him carrying the flag in the annual 4th of July parade. Mr. Martin is the father of a grown daughter who lives in Richmond, Virginia, and is a friendly and familiar face to the many who know him in our town. Please welcome Harry Martin. I'd like to, we thought we would like to begin this program with 5 minutes of a home movie with no audio, and it's very shaky like a 1938 home movie, that was lent to us by Sue Bullock, who lives in East Hampton, whose father took it right after the hurricane, and we thought it would be a nice way to start the program. Mrs. Cameron, would you mind dimming the lights a little bit? Thanks. Okay, now some of you are not going to have a great view of this, but when you watch it on TV later, it'll be easy to see.
Should we have these lights out?
That's okay, that's okay.
Get back anymore.
No, just I think this is the Maidstone.
Maidstone Club.
You know if it was an 8mm film?
An 8mm film? I don't know.
And I wonder if color was available
I
in
know.
8mm at that
I
time.
know. I was amazed that this was in color.
I wonder if it's been colorized. No, it's not home video.
Yeah.
No video there.
No, it was just a
Photographic film. Couldn't have done professionally. Set up.
Want to turn the lights back up? Great. For those of you who didn't really get a very good view, when this is, Matt is going to edit this tape and put it onto a VHS tape, which will be aired on Channel 27 out of East Hampton and out of Riverhead. And when that's done, you'll be able to see it better. For those of you who are interested in seeing it on TV or have friends who want to see it, within a week or so, you can, or 2 weeks maybe, you can call the library and we'll let you know when it's going to be on, or call me. We decided that probably many of you, or some of you actually, were here during the hurricane of 1938, and so at the end we would like to have a little bit of time to hear from the people in the audience. So if you have some questions or comments, if you can hold them till the end, if you can do that, that's great. If you can't, just blurt them out. But but I'd like to start by just asking Mr. Hendrickson to just tell us a little bit about hurricanes and what causes them and how they get started. Can you do that?
Sure. Hurricanes form off of the west coast of Africa. They are not hurricanes then. They are just weather depressions. And as they migrate across the South Atlantic and go towards the Caribbean, if they are to become a hurricane, after they're halfway across, then they do start to get that counterclockwise circulation and start to grow. That is some of them. Many of them do not grow until they get near some of the Caribbean islands. But the farther west they come, if they're going to be a hurricane like you see on TV in the front pages of the paper later, that is where by the Caribbean they are into a first-class hurricane. And we still don't know which direction they are going to go. We do, through weather maps and air pressure and air currents, humidity, temperature, we do try to plot them. And every year we are getting more definite, plotting them better, and to their velocity and to their path, at least up to the middle of the United States or over the Gulf or through Mexico. And they have been known to make one complete circle down in the Caribbean and then start up again. So they are very evasive. There's a lot that we still do not know. We have planes that go up and monitor them, and we can tell how high the clouds are. And a real hurricane always has a open space in the middle with the sun shining through and no clouds. And they are tremendously damaging. The amount of water that they can carry is unbelievable. Their forward speed can vary from 2 or 3 miles an hour to over 60, like the hurricane in '38 was when it passed over Long Island, Connecticut, and went on up into Canada. The velocity of a hurricane is strongest on its upper side, that is the northern side, or the northeast. And it seems that once they hit the Caribbean, if they are coming up the coast, they get their greatest velocity obtained when they get up to the Carolinas, from there on up. But there are the ones that just go across Florida, or go up into the Mississippi River, and all of those, they vary tremendously. They can be 10 miles, 110, and they can be 150. They have many categories as far as miles per hour, and there's just, each one is a study in itself, and just something separate that is velocity, forward speed, and rainfall pertaining to that one.
Was the hurricane of 1938 the most severe hurricane that we have ever had on Long Island?
Oh, no. No, there was
Can you tell us a little bit about the others?
In 1815, there was the most severe storm on Long Island that has ever been recorded in this locality. And as for miles per hour, we had no way of measuring it. I have never heard how long before it hit here they knew it was coming. Transportation, sailboats, the fastest you could go was on a horse, I suppose. But nobody knew of this until it hit. The facts of that hurricane are simple. No beach dune left. None. Absolutely flat. The ocean filled Mecox Bay so high that the water of the bay, which was then practically all salt water from the ocean, rose to a point where it washed over what is now the railroad tracks in back of Watermill and filled Lake Now We Donut, Watermill Lake, with salt water. That puts the windmill on the village green under 8 to 10 feet of water. We have no record of wind velocity, as I said before, but we do know that it unroofed and blew down buildings that were handmade, hewn out of oak and mortar and tendon or pegged together. It blew down all the orchards. It blew down practically all the primeval oak forests. They were gone.
Were there any homes on the beach way back then?
No. The fishermen, cod fishermen or the whalemen and like that, they might have had a boat there, but anything of value was never left there. They did have a shanty or a shack made out of washed up timber, and that's where they'd get, if they were down fishing, and go in there, get out of the rain or the wind, and then later come home. But nothing as we know it today of our beach buildup.
Do they know how many people were lost in that 1815?
No, they don't, because that was the period of sailing ships, and ships left, say, Sag Harbor or New London or New York or Boston, and they were never heard from again. We don't know whether they were 500 miles at sea and were destroyed, of course the men drowned, or what. But that is the most severe storm that has ever been recorded. There were other areas that had more severe storms down south, but we're speaking now of eastern Long Island.
I guess the memory of that had long been erased because, I mean, I've read a couple of places that around the time that the 1938 hurricane hit, there was just a general feeling that we don't get big storms like that here. Was there not?
The word hurricane was never used. We get a northeaster and going to have high surf on the beach and some erosion, but nobody mentioned that word hurricane. The first mention of that word was Mr. W.I. Halsey in Bridgehampton, who had a lady from Jamaica that was his housekeeper and cook. And she said to Mr. Halsey, the morning of the hurricane. Now remember, it had rained for 3 days before, a couple of them heavy, and it was humid, and at times foggy, and there wasn't much air. And that morning, the lady from Jamaica said to Mr. Halsey, this feels like hurricane weather. First time it was ever mentioned, the word hurricane. So she knew more than the Weather Bureau.
Right. So this was not a predicted, it was not predicted by anyone then, was it?
Very indirectly. They knew it was coming up the coast. The Weather Bureau has been roasted pretty good, but not paying more attention. They went home. There was wireless from ships and so forth, but it had been off Hatteras and it was going out to sea. Another thing pertaining to that hurricane is that it had only been going to 4 or 8 miles an hour. When it got up near Cape Hatteras, it had a forward speed. Yes, it had winds over 75, 80 miles an hour. And as it got off Hatteras, it started to accelerate in a forward speed. When that hurricane passed over Long Island and Connecticut, the Sound on up through, it had a forward speed of the then unheard of 60 miles an hour. I think it's about the fastest hurricane we have any record of, forward speed. As far as wind velocity here, from damage that was done, yes, the high ocean and waves, but we don't think there was any wind speed around here much more than 150, maybe a gust of 120. If it was over that, there would have been much more building damage done, inland as well as near the ocean.
I guess the fact that it was moving along at such a rapid clip was really fortunate for the homes around here, because it passed through pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It was only about an hour and a half, 2 hours at the most, it was gone. And then the wind, of course, came in from the northwest and blew pretty near as hard.
I heard someone told a story, and I don't remember who it was, about someone who had, and I think this is a story that a lot of people tell, about someone who had bought a barometer that day. Do you know that story?
Yes, I think it originated up in West Ham. Someone bought a barometer. So the article has been in the papers and written in magazines. They bought a barometer and got it, and there it is down to 28 something, very low, and that means a storm, not always a hurricane, but a severe storm. So he wrapped that thing up, sent it back to the post office, and said, "This is wrong." I didn't have long to wait.
Now, you had already been collecting weather data for some time in 1938.
Yes.
So can you tell us what your instruments looked like that morning of
Well,
September 21st?
At that time, we didn't have wind speed indicators. We had a barometer, and we had had the rain a couple of days before, 3 days before, and we really never realized the seriousness of it until after lunch at noon hour, and that's when the wind really started in the northeast and went to the east, and then the southeast, and then the south, then the southwest, and all that south and southwest was the real high velocity. And of course, after that started to pass us, why, the sun came out, the wind came down. My wife, which was working in the town hall in Southampton at the time, got in the old Model A Ford Roadster and started for Bridgehampton. In one place, she went under a tree with a car. She went under 1.5 feet of water where the old Mecox Bay duck farm used to be. Got to Bridgehampton where the flagpole monument is and walked home. Climbed up trees and slid down the other side.
And meanwhile, you didn't know where she was, did you?
No, I told her to stay there overnight. And the wind blew just as hard on the way coming home as it did going.
It was lucky she made it, really, wasn't it?
Very, very fortunate she made it. Ruined my Ford car.
One of the things that's up here on the table that you might want to take a look at later is a letter written by the late Mrs. Hendrickson, and it was a letter to a friend, I believe,
Her
right?
mother.
A very long letter, 3 or 4 pages, and it's really an interesting letter, and it's also in Mr. Hendrickson's book. Before we hear any more stories of that day, can you just show us a couple of the instruments that you brought here?
Well, this is antique.
Do you want to hold up a couple?
We all like to collect antiques mostly. This is French. It's a very old French wind speed indicator. It is in meters, and it's very sensitive. And you can hold this up and watch it, and with a stopwatch, if you can calculate in a hurry, you can get the meters per hour that it is blowing. Today, we have on top of the home or house, we have a pipe with a little rotor and a wind vane. And then through electricity, down it comes in on the desk in the office, and it gives you the miles per hour, the wind direction, and a secondary needle. The first needle will kick the second needle over to the highest wind gust. Say it hit a gust over to 65 miles an hour, and the rest of the day it only blew 60 or 48 or 55. That needle will stay at 65, so you knew what the highest gust was for that day. That is a wind speed indicator. These are modern instruments, and the one I have home, which has been up for a number of years, has only been hit 4 times with lightning, so I put another one up. There's more things than hurricanes. This my dad gave me back when we first started in with the Weather Service, and I'm very proud of it. It is a very old aneroid barometer, and it's open-faced. You can see the insides of it. And in the back, it came out of Sag Harbor, is written the Bonnie Jean. So it was probably off a 2, 3, 4, 5-masted schooner that came ashore someplace. And there's the 3 tabs where you could fasten it onto the cabin wall when the ship leaned and it didn't flop around. So that is, I know several of the fellows from the U.S. Weather Service have been down and they admire this. Very nice. It's still in working condition, but it's not to within 2 or 3 hundredths. The little chain that revolves and unrevolves has, of course, worn a little bit, but it still works.
What I'd like to do is just talk about that day a little bit. Now, you've told us a little bit from the point of view of a weather person, but can you tell us in a little bit more detail about that day, what that day was like for you in 1938?
Yes, we were busy certifying poultry on the farm, and one of the professors was down from Cornell, and we went to these chickens where they're all checked over and blood tested by a veterinarian, a leg band put on. And in the morning, I said, it's going to blow pretty good. I had a small sailboat down to Noyak. I said, I'm going down, put another rope on it. I don't really call that intuition or what. I'd never even thought of a hurricane. But I went down, put another rope on the boat. Came back, and it was raining a little harder and a little harder. And we had 1 row of 5 large buildings that we did. Came back and started on another building. It was 20 by 80 foot long. That had 600 chickens in it, and a big flat roof. And the posts in the middle were 4 by 4s. And as we were working in that, this roof started to go up and down. And the 4 by 4 posts at the bottom that were in the concrete had an iron rod up in the post, and you'd see that iron rod showing every once in a while. So we piled a bunch of chicken crates up, so if the roof went, why, we had a place to flop down and wouldn't get crushed to death. It got kind of hairy after a while, so we thought we'd better get out. We got out and went to the farmhouse. We looked down where the other 5 buildings were that we had done, and there were 3 left. 2 were gone. You never saw a chicken. The only thing you saw was some feeders and water fountains. Everything was gone.
The buildings were gone?
The buildings were gone, right to Kindlewood. These were very well built, not a chicken shack. These were well built buildings with 2 by 10 timbers on the roof. Heavy. Now, The farmhouse in the 20s needed a new roof, and John's Mansville salesman was around, and he said, put on our new roof. It's guaranteed forever. It was not a wood shingle roof. It was the new asbestos slate shingle. They were laid on the roof after horse feathers were put on to make the shingle roof level, and then the felt put on, and then there were copper nails, big rivets that went up through these holes. Now they weigh 3.5 pounds apiece. These flew off of the house.
This very shingle, right?
Yes, this is one of them. Over as far as your restaurant on Job's Lane. And hit the pasture where the cattle, milk cows were, and buried in the turf. If those shingles flying through the air on a 100-mile-an-hour wind ever hit a person, it cut him in half. So I hope with that just statement, you will know enough when you get a 60 or 80-mile-an-hour gale not to go out. It'll take the reflector off a light or a limb off a tree or a sign from the side of the road, and air currents whip it up and take it down 400 or 500 feet, and heaven help you, you're not in the way. It's tremendous. I have heard on the since those hurricanes, the ones we had in the later in the 40s, and a couple in the 50s. I lived for 50 years in a house right across the way from the woods, and I have heard the limbs go off of the tree exactly as a cannon shot. They don't have time to tear or to bend or to be torn. They're just crack, gone. And I think a gust of wind probably is gone in 1/10 of a second. That's how quick it goes. It's just like an explosion.
So, to get back to that day, you must have been shocked to see these buildings gone.
Oh, yes, and then down where we raised all our 4,000 young chickens, there was 23 buildings in that farm, and they were all wrecked. The wind took the chickens, a good part of them, and held them against the 5-foot fence, and the rain drowned them. And then where was the dairy herd? We had 30 head of milkers. Well, they were about 800 feet away, down in a slight hollow, a depression. And afterwards, they were glad to see us. Electricity off, milk 30 cows by hand. Then go out and collect the eggs, pack them at night, get up at 5 o'clock and milk the 30 cows again. Ventilation on the chickens, start to repair the buildings. What did a man get at that time? What did he earn? Remember, this was Depression years. When my first wife and I were married in 1935, she couldn't teach. Two in the same family, couldn't have a job. One of the plumbers I knew very well worked for Sanford, Virginia Water Company. His boy had a paper route. They took his paper route away. Gave it to another man son who wasn't working. Standard wage, $2 a day. We had 2 carpenters come from Sag Harbor. They got on the train, it cost 10 or 15 cents. They were on the farm at 8 o'clock in the morning and worked till 12. No mid-morning break then. Got stopped, maybe got a drink of water. You worked till 12, half hour for lunch, worked from 12:30 to 3 o'clock, got on the train and went home. One was Arthur Gunning, an excellent carpenter, built many buildings on the farm before and after the hurricane. The other man was Mr. Hunt, Herb Hunt, who was a master carpenter. He could build anything, cabinets to houses. Standard wage, each one, $2 a day. We've come a long way.
During the day, when you realized there was all this destruction happening, did you, talk to your neighbors? Was there an air of panic around the farm? I mean, did you think it was a hurricane or?
No. Well, I really think when we saw the eye come through, yes.
You knew that what was happening.
We
You
knew what was happening from reading weather books and having been with the Weather Service then for 8 years. Yes, we were passing through a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody knew it by that evening. But it's a thing that...
Did you spend the rest of the day then after you realized what was going on? Did you head for home and stay in the farmhouse for the rest of the day?
No, I went down. I worked through when it was northwest winds. It was some of the parts of the chicken house were flopped over on 8 or 10 chickens, and you went down, or 20 chickens, you went down to get it out. This was, you had to.
Then what time did your wife get home?
About, I think she pulled in along between 7 and 8.
A sight for sorry eyes, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was very unusual. She later became a welfare investigator for the county, and she and Miss Nesbitt, the town nurse, were the first two to Montauk. That truck killed my Ford car because Napeague Strait was all under salt water.
Yes, sir.
For your information, the Indians call Napeague the land of water. Now they're building big condominiums down there.
All right, let's move on down and ask Mr. Harry Williams to tell us about that day. Can you?
I can't tell it like Mr. Hendricks.
Well, you weren't quite as old as he was.
But being on the reservation, now, we didn't have electricity. We didn't have radios, naturally, not even a battery radio. So I was a youngster in school. We had a one-room school on the reservation, and all we knew that there was a bad storm. And we wasn't allowed, when it did reach its peak there, we had to sit quiet in the school. And so we was not aware that 1938, that's the first time I ever heard the word hurricane. And so we wasn't aware that we was in a hurricane.
Were you all in one room, all the students in one room?
All the students, just like we're in here.
About how many students were there?
Oh, I have to turn back the dial of time here to see. I see one student that was in there, my buddies back there, and my young sister there, she was there. But let's say there was 38, 30 in that neighborhood of children on there, because other children were, other students was already down in Southampton High School.
I see.
So, however, with the storm raging, we were next to our church. We also had a little church there on the reservation, and when someone noticed that the church was moving, and that church turned off in the foundation. It was headed, it used to face, as my memory serves me right, north and south. And when finished up, it was headed east and west. And it was damaged, and we still was not aware that there was a hurricane. But all of this is going on around us, and the next thing, no one came as yet because the storm hadn't let up enough, and where the older men were, they were on their jobs working, and mothers were working in the village. But one mother did come through that storm with her boots on to see where her children were. And she's still living today. But we were kept there until the storm ceased, and I'm listening to Mr. Hendricks, maybe around 3:30, 4 o'clock it lightened up. And then people then, there was very few cars on the reservation. And mostly they were Model A Fords, as you said, and you was wealthy enough, you had not a Model T, but a Model A. That was later. And they would began to come with cars to get their children. And then some of us joined hands and went home together.
Went home together?
Yes. And we didn't have a lot of paved roads like we got on the reservation now. And but each one of us was able to get home safely. And word didn't come to us till that night, or maybe the next morning, as I remember, that it was a hurricane. And but the big thing was, after seeing our little church damaged, the newspaper's account of 2 women that were lost in Southampton and were drowned. And the papers say they were lifelong residents of the village. But those ladies were from the Shinnecock Reservation. They lived in the village, and there was a mother and 3 daughters. And what was told, what I can remember, and then it's in the papers, the old papers, that one of the ladies, the 3 sisters and the mother was in her 80s. The sister that was driving the car. Then they were going to the hospital to see the daughter that was in there had just given birth to a little girl, I think. And like everyone else, fascinated by the ocean and what was going on. They didn't go directly to the hospital. They came down through the village and went down First Neck Lane. And then as they got down there, the storm increased and the trees had come down. And they could not get any further, so they came around by the beach club, as we call it, the Bathing Corporation. And that's where they got stuck. And as my memory serves me right, there was other people in the beach club for shelter. And these 4 ladies went in there, and I imagine they must have been mostly men in there, and they helped them to get in. But by then, the big tidal wave that did come up caught one of the ladies, and they believed that she drowned right on that road. And they were both found, both of the ladies, next day on the east side of Agawam Lake. But the mother and the other daughter, the men helped save them. And they say they found a home along there. They had to leave the beach club because the water came in there, and then they found a home that was open along there with the door ajar, and this old party, maybe of 15 or 18 people, went in this house, and then they had to take shelter on the 2nd floor because the water had come in that house. And with all of that I remember, I read and was told later on, but the sad part was that these ladies and their families, which I see some grandchildren of one of the ladies, is Eleanor sitting right there, and her father's mother was lost in that storm, and other people in here. And that was the sad part for the reservation, because we was all, from children up, such a close-knit group of people,
Right.
like one big family. And
How long did it take before you got word that that had happened?
it was later in that evening.
Later in that evening?
When I recall that the men were able to move around, and word came, we was all in the homestead, and my grandmother on my mother's side was living there, and we was in the home with her. And my grandmother and the lady, the mother of these 3 daughters, were sister-in-laws. They had married 2 brothers. And word came and when we were brought up, a relative or a cousin who was older, we called everyone Aunt so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so. So when word came that the lady's name was Florence Franklin Hunter, Florence Lee Franklin Hunter. All right, that Aunt Florence had been lost, and Aunt Della, she was Della Lee Johnson. They were both lost, and the men looked all night, the men of the village and the men from the reservation, and they found them the next day. And that I remember that part very well. There's much more to it than I can relate.
During that day, were you afraid as a child? I mean, what kind of an atmosphere was it during the storm when you were in that schoolhouse? Were you afraid, or was it just an adventure?
Some of us boys wasn't afraid. We didn't know enough. We hadn't learned enough to fear anything, I guess, because I see one of my buddies back there that was in school with me, and I don't think we didn't know what was going on, so we wasn't afraid.
Right.
But we were more afraid the next day after we realized what had happened.
Right.
And the buildings, the lumber and timbers that had piled up in the reservation. Those of you that don't know the reservation, it's in a horseshoe of water. Water on all 3 sides. And all around those shores, the timbers was piled higher than this building. I guess whole houses that had come over from Mauritius and West Hampton and all, because the inlet came through at that time, the Shinnecock Inlet. And as young boys again, we spent our time playing in the meadows and around the waters, so we knowed every inch of the reservation. And the next day, when it was naturally no school, we all of us young boys on the reservation and older than I, we just went out to see what was going on. And now, along with that, there was one house that I recall that was lost, and I see the daughter and the grandson, Marjorie and David, sitting back there. Their mother's house, Marjorie would have to remember this, their house was demolished.
Completely demolished.
And that, to my recollection, that was the only house that was lost. There was buildings that went down, outbuildings. On the way from our school, there was a big building. We called it big, but we was told that at one time it was a laundry house, because one of the older ladies, or several of them, they used to take in laundry, washing and ironing, they called it, with the flat iron that you heat on the stove. And on the way from not far from the school stood this old, big, strong building. And the two of the young boys that went to school, they lived there with their father, the Lisa family. So those boys used to stop there and play lots of times. And on Saturdays, we was allowed to play like it was a playhouse after a while, because it was no longer used as a laundry. That went down. That was finished. And that was sad for us then. But one thing, a day after, maybe the second day after, us young boys joined together, and we had no electricity, so we have water hand pumps on the reservation, and we found out there was no water anywhere in the village. So we got our heads together, and I don't know who took the credit for it, and we got all the gallon containers we could find and cleaned and rinsed them out. And one of the older fellows had a Model 8 Ford with no top on it, a rumble seat, and we packed all the water we could in this car and went in the village. And I was one of them. Jim's back there somewhere. We started selling water 25 cents a gallon. We should have been head of the Great Bear Water Company. Fast as we could get in the village with a carload of water, empty because they couldn't keep our containers. Give us our 25 cents, and back to the reservation we'd go, and we had boys there pumping. And so the first stop we made was we went to the Catholic Sisters on Hill Street. And we shouldn't have never sold them water, but we didn't. And then all along Hill Street, we went to places. I know where my grandmother worked and my mother worked, and we went and knocked on the door. Oh, this cute little fella here, and oh yes, we'll buy water. We need water. How many gallons can we get? Well, how many quarters have you got? So we get back, and by nighttime, the older people found out what their boys was doing, and that ended that. And we never attempted to sell any more water or anything in a disaster we were supposed to help, not. So that was part of that hurricane.
It was a lesson, a lucrative lesson.
Oh, yes. And
I want to.
So many more things went on, but.
Well, we'll talk again about some of the other things too. Let's go down the line to Mrs. Lord and hear what your day was like on September 21st. Now, I know you were a teenager.
I was a teenager, and I was going to boarding school, but I hadn't gone yet, and so there was a friend of mine that was still here, and she said, well, let's go to the movies, because it's not a very nice day. So we said, fine. She had a little roadster. And as we left, my father said, I think it's just the funniest light I've ever seen in the sky. It's all sort of a yellowy color, and I've never seen anything like that. And do you think you ought to go? And we said, oh, certainly, we're fine. So we got down to the movies, and we went in, and we had our seat, and the wind was blowing very hard, and the chandelier, as some of you can remember, was there, and it was going backwards and forwards. And we sort of looked at it and said, I think we better get out of here. So we all went to the lobby, and the manager locked the door. He said, absolutely no one can get out. You're here because it's a terrible storm, and at that point, you could see trees being uprooted and just sort of moving, and cars were being swept down the street. I mean, we all were just bug-eyed, really. You've never seen anything like it. And sort of towards the end of this, I guess, this poor water-soaked person was at the door of the movie house banging on the window, and I said, it's my mother. What is she doing here? I was simply horrified, and my poor mother was worried about all of her children. My brother and sister were at school, and she had gone there to see if they were all right. My sister was 6, and she said that she was in 1st grade, and so our mother came to get her, and she got out of the school, and she was so little that the wind just blew her right across the lawn, And Mother was running after her, and we thought, oh my goodness, you know, she thought she was going to be blown away forever. So she said, Mummy was racing after her, and she caught me, and then my brother, in the meantime, went, I think some friends of his picked him up, and they crawled on their hands and knees into a car. And so they all got into this car, and my mother had a whole carload full of little children that she was going to drop home, and then her car stopped, so she was on Elm Street, and I don't know whose house she stopped in front of, but she dashed in with all these children and said, could you please keep all these children until, I don't know when, I don't know who they were, or whatever happened to them. Obviously they got home, and she saw that my brother was in this car with a family, and so she put my little sister in there, and they went off, but she was worried about me, so she walked from the school, the high school, which is now the town hall, all the way to the movie theater. Why she lived through it, she said she dodged in and out of doorways and so forth, because she was so afraid that she and my friend would get out and start wandering around in the middle of the storm. But anyway, so the storm was over, and then we all went to the Irving house, and people were coming in there from the beach and so forth, and I see Gordon Hammersley here, and I remember your mother so well was there with a little baby in her arms, and I must have been one of your brothers or sisters, and there were a lot of people gathering, and so my mother got some towels and dried off, and then she said, well, my car's gone, but Eleanor, let's get into your car if we can find it, which we did, and she said, well, just drive around and see what we can find out, if we can see anything. Well, you couldn't get up and down the roads anywhere because there were trees all over the place, but we got as far as Wickapog and Old Town Road, and there were 3 or 4 men there, and they hailed us, and they said, we're simply exhausted. We've been working along the beach trying to save people and get people that are there out of their houses, and we're so tired, and we have to go back to the firehouse. Can you give us a lift? So Mother said, well, certainly I can do that. And so Eleanor and I got out of the car, and she said, now don't move from here. Just sit here. And I'm going to take these 4 men back to the firehouse, which she did. And so then she brought back a whole nother crew. And then she said, I think we better try and get home. We lived in Hampton Park at that time. And it took us hours to get home. We had to, you know, sort of wander around. And we finally did get home. And my father was frantic, but he was glad finally to see us. He didn't know what had happened to anybody. And so that was basically what I remember of them.
There was no telephone.
There was no telephone, there was no electricity, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I can remember we had our own pump so that we did have water. And we were luckier than a lot of our neighbors around. But we lost about 60 trees in our place, and it was quite an experience. I mean, we all just sort of lived in, you know, with no electricity and no anything. But it wasn't as bad probably as it is today, where everything you have is electric.
I read in a couple of accounts about people's, how unsettling it was to see the entire landscape change so drastically because of the loss of the trees. It must have been different on your property.
Well, it was terrible. I mean, there were just great gaping holes. I mean, we children thought it was fun because we climbed all over it, but it really, when you come to think of it, wasn't so much fun.
Right. Harry Martin, can you tell us about your day on that day?
Well, I could tell you about it. I look back and I see I see Dr. Lewis's daughter back there, Mrs. Holden. Do you remember that day?
Yeah.
Right behind where you live. We had planted 3,000 strawberry plants that day, from Herrick Road back to your father's house, across to Dr. Glanville's house. We had it all set. There was a fellow worked with us from Florida. His name was Prince Brown. And that morning, he said to me, he says, "We're going to have a hurricane." I said, "Man, you're crazy. We've never had a hurricane." He says, "Watch it." We went home at 12 o'clock, back in the field at 1 o'clock, and the wind began to come up, you know, just up, up, up. And I was working for Bellows. That's who I was working for. And I guess about 2 o'clock, we had to leave that field. We tried to get back to where the Bellows lived. They had that house on, well, they still have the house on Lewis Street, and all the way over to Old Town Road. They had a Model T4 truck. And we drove that truck, we got into the field, and that's as far as we could go. The whole garage, they had a 12-foot door, sliding door, that was gone. They had 150 feet of cold frames, they were all gone. Everything was wrecked. So the boss said to us, Archie Bellows, he says, well, one of his sons is still around here, Charlie, he says to us, "Well, I'll take you home." So we had an old Essex. I'll never forget that car. He starts out, all the trees were down, all the wires were down, everything was down all the way. I only live on Halsey Avenue. It only took me about 5 minutes to go home. I guess it took about a half hour to get home that day, and I was in the house, and we had trees in the yard, a big apple tree, and I just watched it doing that, going like that, going all of a sudden, laid down. All the cherry trees, everything, all of them just laid right down. Now, talk about the ocean. We used to go down to the ocean. There were 3 sets of dunes you'd go over. Hurricane of 38 left it just like that. Down Wickapar Road, down behind the Fowlers. There was a road went right out to the beach. There was a pond on either side where we used to go fishing as children. Fill those ponds right up. I guess I was looking, I saw Glenn Halsey there. Well, he should know about that. Those ponds back there, because there was one, I think, behind his father's house. But if you go down there today and go back, you would never know there were 2 ponds there. That whole section where those 2 ponds were, the ocean just filled up with sand. The whole ocean front, all along the beach, I remember that. And when you talk about hurricanes, I think about 1953, I worked for Gallucci down there in Gin Lane from 49 to 64. And I've seen the ocean walk right through the Old Town Pond, so I know it is about hurricanes down there, and the water. I could tell you all about that. Anytime the hurricane hit Cape Hatteras, we had to start closing everything up. But you never knew how it was going to work. Sometimes you'd take everything in, and you'd get nothing. The same 38 hurricane, as soon as we got home, they started coming through, picking men up. We went down, Frankenbach had a store on Hampton, on the main street. You could go in there, they go in there, you get an axe, you get a saw, and we go right up to where the Earring House is, and we started cutting trees, going back toward the beach.
Was that the next day or the
same day?
The same day.
See, because when the storm, when the eye got here, everything got quiet. The sun came out nice, and then it began to get men to work. But we started working down there, and then it came back to us again. And I was thinking about Dick when he was talking about that lady from down Jamaica. She was telling about the hurricane. Well, this is the same thing we got from this man from Florida. But we never heard of a hurricane before. You know anything about a hurricane? We used to laugh. No, they'll never hit Long Island. But now, every time you get a big windstorm, everybody says hurricane. But all these people that live out on the ocean front down the beach, they can have it. They can have it. I'll tell you that right now. After 1953, does anybody know where Gallucci's is?
Sure.
Went down Gin Lane and Wyandass Lane. You ever go out in front of that place?
It's always flooded in.
Yeah, but I mean, have you ever been out in front of the property now? Have you ever seen that concrete wall there?
Yeah, it's undermined.
That right there. If you knew how much work was put in that concrete wall down there. We worked 1 year, every single day, 6 days a week. Southampton Lumber brought us 50 bags of cement. Darien Bad brought us 2 or 3 truckloads of sand and gravel. We poured concrete there. washed it out. It was big rocks and poured concrete there for about 6 months.
Was that after the 54 or the 38?
54.
Harry, when you talk about the saws, were they two-man saws or one-man saws? They weren't power saws, right?
No.
No, I mean, there was one. That's what you told me.
No,
There was
not 38.
One
Power saw.
Bridgehampton had one.
Nope.
But in general, they were
Hand saws.
hand saws.
Hand saws.
Now,
And
how long did the cleanup take after the 38 hurricane?
Oh boy, 2 or 3 weeks.
2 or 3 weeks.
There were a lot of places in the village, like over on Hampton Road. I don't know if anybody remembers where Ruland's garage was. Anybody remember that? Yeah. Well, that whole area there, the sidewalks are up, the trees are down, all the way, just that whole section through there. Even at the high school. Now, I was talking, my sister called me night before last. Her birthday is the 26th. She called me from the Bronx. And I spoke to her about the hurricane, and that we were going to have this thing. She says, I remember. She was in high school then. The slate off the roof came right through the window. And wherever one of the teachers was sitting, she had just gotten up and the slate cut the chair right in half. But see, I was out of high school in 35. That's when I finished high school, so I wasn't there. But
Right.
1938,
Right.
that was the first, and I don't want to see any more of them.
What did Main Street look like after that hurricane, in Southampton anyway?
Trees down, wires down. And see, that was the whole thing. There were trees and wires, and they were down everywhere. There was no electricity.
For how long was there no electricity?
About 6, 7 days. Some places maybe more than that. It's according to where you were.
Weeks, months.
For weeks.
According to where you were.
Now, I guess you mentioned, Mr. Hendrickson, that because you had a farm that really required electricity, yours was turned back a little bit sooner, I
I
think.
think we got it in 2 or 3 days.
Right.
I think I'd like to mention this. The greatest that you didn't realize until later, the greatest thing that hit you was the hurricane was September 21st. It was summer yet. The trees were in full leaf. And we had had rain. And when the hurricane passed, there were a very few younger trees that were standing. But all the leaves were gone. They were pasted against buildings, blown away. And when you went out the next morning and looked, why, here's like a war zone. With just sticks and broken limbs sticking up in the air. Another very interesting thing, there are tornadoes in a hurricane. If you ever remember or heard or saw a picture of the Sag Harbor Whalers Church, 185 feet high, a tornado lifted that steeple up off of the church, moved it over about 40 feet, and let go of it. And it dropped. It practically telescoped when it hit the ground. If you went up near the Yap Hank in the middle of the island in an airplane and looked down, you could see large areas, a quarter, eighth of a mile in diameter of oak trees that's just blown down in a circle here, a circle there. There are tornadoes in a hurricane.
Gee, I don't like hearing that one bit. So the stores were closed in town for a few days, were they?
As far as we can remember.
Was there any reporting, were there any reports of any looting or any, theft of property or anything like that? What was the community response to this, besides gouging and things like that?
I don't think there was any looting because everybody was surprised, something happened like that. And everybody was trying to get things set. Houses were down, this was down, the other thing was down. They were trying to get water, electricity, so everybody was
People help each other out.
Had people policing, various roads so people wouldn't go down to the beach and so forth. I mean,
for their safety?
For their safety, yeah. They had, I mean, my husband did that. He had a certain period of time where he was supposed to stand at a corner and stop the traffic. anybody that was here.
Right.
And then too, in them days, as I could recall, you had a different type of people. You didn't have all the looting and things that go on today. That was, people help people. And that was what our community was all about. Love and respect and helping one another. And it was the same way throughout the village.
Did most of you know people who had lost their homes, who were taken in by other people? Did any of you?
Well, as I say, I only know what happened within the reservation, and Margie, her family had, her mother, grandfather, and grandmother had a large home, and that's where they went for until. Am I right, Margie? Yeah. And, but everyone helped one another and took someone in. There wasn't the houses wasn't so badly damaged on the reservation that people couldn't still live in them. But everyone pitched in and helped everyone. The people from the village helped the people on the reservation, as well as the people from the reservation would go in the village and help. That's what I remember as a youngster.
Just a bit about farms. You were farmers. Were many farms destroyed? Were the losses tremendous on farms?
Many of them lost their outbuildings where they kept their truck or their farm equipment, back of the beach banks. Many of the fields along from Southampton right through Wainscott, they were covered several feet deep with beach sand, and they cleared a small amount of it away with earth movers later. Why, most of the potatoes are still there, but don't go try to dig them up. You know.
I mean, you mentioned that it was more or less a boon for the local economy in a way, and to sort of end the Depression in a way. But I guess for the farmers, it must have taken a while to get out from under.
That's farming.
Yeah.
I would say everybody was so busy taking care of the older or anyone that was injured. You all had a window blown in, a chimney blown off, a door blown out, a roof off of the building. And you had all you could do to take care of your own. And if there was the older ones, like you've heard say here tonight, why, you took care of your neighbor as well as you took care of yourself. That really come first. And it was a different day the next day when you got up, a different day. My wife over here, Lillian, she went through it too. And she lived down to Mecox. Water came up, many buildings washed away, damaged. I think the people that lost a store or the people that lost a crop, and of course the ones that lost a roof, they were the ones that really were hurt. Because people had money and you didn't spend it. This was Depression years. If it was a quarter or 50 cents, you saved it. You didn't do anything except necessity. But when the '38 hurricane came, you had to have a roof on the house. You had to have that window put back in, and you had to have that chimney rebuilt because you've got to have a fire in the stove and one thing and another. And I like to think that was the beginning of good times again, because everyone worked, everyone was getting money, and you had to have those things repaired, and you took your savings and did it. You didn't want to hurt anymore.
What do you think the chances are that we could have another storm like that? You didn't predict the first one, but maybe you can predict the next one. No.
I can. 5 years ago, Lou, we were invited to a banquet over near Port Jefferson, celebrating the 100 years of the U.S. Weather Service. The best on weather from Washington, Kennedy Airport, LaGuardia, Boston. I liked the head meteorologist from Canada, the best speaker. I thought he was tops. There, all their talk can be summed up in this. We have polluted our stratosphere. We have a more intense sun. And the powers that be and know, the ones that have suffered it, all studied it all their life, predict that because of this higher temperatures, we are going to have more tropical storms. Some of them will be more severe than in the past. And if, while some of the papers don't put it in, all the local papers get a monthly summary of my weather for the month. And I've written about sunburn, about skin cancer, and take your tan in extreme, moderate amounts, because it keeps the dermatologist alive. Yes, we are going to get another one. Now, whether we're going to get one next year or 20 years from now, I don't know. We do know there was a bad one back in 1635. We do know that we had a severe one in 1815. We know we had one in 38. That is up here. I'm not talking about the tropic Florida or anything. 1815 to 1938. Now we're only 1938 to the turn of the century. It's only 40, 50 years, 50, 54 years. In my book, it took 40 years to get together. In weather data, I have found, in going over the old records, that we have an increase of 1 degree every 100 years. At this large banquet seminar that we had in talking, the polar ice caps are melting, and to the best of their ability, the ocean is rising 1 foot every 100 years. It's hard to believe. And you read your history books. Back, the ocean used to be a half mile further at sea. Our land is slowly going. We don't get it all in one storm. We lose a few feet some year. Maybe some years it builds up a few feet. But in the run, long run, ocean takes the south shore of Long Island. It is all sand. And if you put your concrete or steel bulkheads or stay pods or whatever in, that's built on sand, and invariably it will go. I think sometimes photographs I have of our beach being littered with busted up rolls of splintery wire or snow fence and cesspool covers sitting out there and poles and steel and stuff. We're the educated ones. What have we done? What a place for our grandchildren to play on.
I think in a couple of minutes, I actually had a lot more questions, but I want to hear if you all have some questions or comments. But before we do that, I'd just sort of like to end with a little story that you told the other day, one of your workers on your farm.
Yeah.
Would you tell us that?
Sure. We had several working on the farm at that time. And 2 or 3 days later, when we had time, you might say, to talk, my father said to this fellow that was working, a man in his 45 or so, why do you think the Lord ever gave us a thing like this? Roof off of the house, milk cows by hand, storm damage, people hurt, lives lost. The destruction was terrible. Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Hendrickson, He just wanted you to know who's boss.
That's all right. That's
Okay, I'd like to thank all four of you for being here very much. But before we end, is there someone in the audience or a couple people in the audience who have memories of that time and could share them quickly with us? Well, where's Glenn Halsey? I know he was...
he was here, I know.
Oh, Mr. Cameron.
I could talk all night about that hurricane. I was asleep when I got finished.
Yeah.
I could comment on one aspect of it. I was 10 years old. I was in the 6th grade at the Southampton grade school, which in those days was a brand new school. It had a 3-story brick building, slate roof, and I walked to school that day. It didn't look too bad. But about 10:30, 11 o'clock, it really began to howl, and our homeroom teacher pulled all the shades down because these kids were jumping up and looking outside. Big fun. And that was too bad. But after a while, as I recall it, along the corridors, at the end of the corridor, on both ends of the school, these great big windows, and they finally just broke in.
Girls
and then, of course, the wind started to howl through the corridors. And our teacher became hysterical, and she just lost total control. And the plaster ceiling started to drift down a little bit, and that made it more historic. So by that time, we all jumped up, us kids, and we pulled the shades up. And I remember seeing, I think he was a building employee, he'd gotten outside, and he just rolled over and over and over like tumbleweed.
Oh.
He lost his footing and waved. And you could see the trees coming down. They didn't all come down fast, but a lot of them just
Eased down, that's right.
And Mr. Hendrickson knows we had a lot of rain for 3 days before that hurricane, with the result that most trees didn't snap. They happened recently. They pulled out.
That's right.
And now the good news
They
there
went
was,
down.
an awful lot of those trees would be saved, and they were winched back up, and guy wires kept them up, and so a lot of trees eventually got saved, otherwise would have been destroyed. But anyway, got to be around, I don't remember the time exactly, I think 12 or 1 o'clock, and we were told by somebody who came around in the school rooms that we were going to be excavating the grade school, a few hundred yards to the high school, where we were all going to be kept in the gymnasium. So they issued football helmets and shoulder pads to the older kids in the high school to come over and get us little urchins. And then they took us from the grade school to the high school. I can't recall whether anybody ever offered us a shoulder pad or a helmet. But we got there. The problem was the slate was coming off like frisbees. It went through the air, and they were frightened, of course, that somebody would get his head chopped off. I don't recall anybody who, in fact, got hurt, but it was a serious danger. And then we got put into the gymnasium in the high school, and volunteers showed up from around town to take the kids home. And I remember a man named Mr. William Buckingham took about 4 or 5 of us kids and got us home. And you asked Harry Williams if he was frightened. We were too young to be frightened.
Yeah.
I think it's, unless you are old enough to know better, or unless you have property of your own, to us it was a great big wonderful. You hear the wind blowing, remember we walked around the electric wires were sputtering, you would go around. And I don't think the full import of it hit me until I finally turned onto we lived on Herrick Road in those days, and I remember we had a house that had 4 big maple trees, and all 4 of those trees are down flat, and the place looked like a bomb. And then I began to realize just how serious this thing was. And then the next day, I took a walk along the beach, and then you really saw the devastation. Most of the home damage. I mean, I don't think anybody in town lost the entire house, but down at the beach, the devastation was it was a very serious thing.
Right. Well, there are reprints of the Southampton Press that came out after the hurricane, and the numbers of houses on the beach that were lost, most of them were lost, I guess, or many of them were lost.
Just sliced right in half.
Yeah.
You can see the plumbing hanging
Right.
on them. Some were lost completely.
Right.
It's lunacy, I think, that people even today consider building houses on the beach.
Right.
That's true. That's right.
Why the people who are responsible for that don't just lunacy.
Right. David Gillespie, I know you have a story about the hurricane. Can you tell us?
Well, this is a story that was told by my mother. I, of course, was not around. But I had an older sister and brother who were here at the time, and my parents rented a house in the village, actually the house opposite still stands, opposite the entrance to the Meadow Club.
South Main.
And my older brother and sister were there with this kind of hysterical French-Canadian governess that took care of them, and my parents were in New York, and my mother seemed to delight in telling the story. I don't know why, but she had a kind of a mordant sense of humor, and I think one of the things it does say about is that people who were, I mean, people here didn't really understand how serious this storm was. They didn't know it was coming until it was upon us, I guess. But certainly people who were not here had no idea, and my parents were in New York, and I guess the telephone lines were still in, but this French-Canadian governess called my mother in New York, panic-stricken about what was going on and what should she do, and she didn't know how to drive. My older sister was 6.5 or 7, and my brother was 5. So she had no idea what to do, and what should she do? My mother not understanding the seriousness of the situation, she said, well, Mazzy, what they called her, make sure you get the silver chest out. I said, what? What do you mean the silver chest? Don't you realize you have 2 children down here? And my mother said, I can always have more children.
Pretty good.
Rode out.
Pretty good.
Again, wrote them up first track one. The silver chest was saved also. They got that.
That's a hard story to follow. Shall we end right here? Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll turn the music back on and hope you'll come next door and have something to drink and cookies.
Great.
Thanks for coming.